Hi, I'm Tim.
I'm Alyssa.
And we're not a bird, we're not a plane, but we're here to discuss the first feature film starring the last son of Krypton. It's Superman, the movie, from 1978.
Once there was a civilization, much like ours, but with a greater intelligence, greater powers, and a greater capacity for good. In one tragic moment, that world was destroyed. But there was one survivor. His name is Kal-El. He will call himself Clark Kent. But the world will know him as Superman. This year, Superman brings you the gift of flight. Superman, the movie.
As the planet Krypton faces fiery destruction, Kryptonian scientist Jor-El and his wife Lara send their son Kal-El to Earth in an escape ship. There, he is adopted by the Kents in rural Kansas, where his alien physiology gives him super strength and speed. Upon learning the truth about who he is, he moves to Metropolis and takes on the persona of Superman, resolving to protect humanity and serve as an example of goodness and decency. He quickly earns the romantic attention of intrepid reporter Lois Lane, but also becomes a target of scheming criminal Lex Luthor, who plots to obliterate the coast of California as part of a real estate swindle, and has discovered the secret to destroying Superman. As usual, we'll be going into spoilers, so if you haven't seen Superman, we recommend watching it before listening to the rest of this episode. Okay, so what are your first experiences with the movie and with the character of Superman in general?
Well, when I was a little tyke back in 1983, one of the things that my dad and I used to do was watch like the Saturday or Sunday afternoon movie, and during that time they would be showing a lot of Superman. And I fell in love with the character. I fell in love with Christopher Reeve. My love of Superman was cemented forever. When I was 4 years old, I was with my mom in the old part of Boston. There's like a film set and they're filming, and it's a costume drama. I remember seeing out of the corner of my eye a very tall man with a mustache and a top hat. And all I remember is running towards him. I ran across the street. My mother had a heart attack. And I started screaming, Superman, Superman, Superman. And this very tall gentleman kind of looks behind him, and indeed it was Christopher Reeve. Somehow, I knew, even through like a different makeup, the man had a mustache, looked totally different from Superman, wasn't even in the tights. But
Did he have on the glasses?
No, not even the glasses. He was filming the Bostonians. So if you've seen that film, you know what he looks like in that film, and that's exactly how he looked. And so he sat down with us, gave me a lollipop. All I remember is just this feeling of, like, I was sitting with the most awesome person on the planet. He was Superman. There was no acting there. That was Superman. Totally charming, totally just awesome. My dad and I had a joke where at the end of the movie where Christopher does this little bank move, it looked to me like he was waving. So I said that to my dad once, and he said, "Oh, he's waving at me." And I'll be like, "No, he's waving at me." Well, I got it from the man himself. I asked him, and I told him the story, and I said, my daddy says that when you wave at the end, you're waving at him, and I know you're waving at me, and you're waving at me, right? And he's like, I remember him saying this. He said, "You tell your dad, I only wave at pretty little girls like you."
Aww.
And you don't always get to meet your heroes, and sometimes when you do, they don't come across exactly as you would like them to be, but for this little 4-year-old girl who was just in awe of this man, he was super. And I always treasure that memory. Later on, when he had his unfortunate accident and and passed away years later, I always remembered that meeting that I had with him, and I felt that I was very honored to have spent that very small amount of time, and to see the embodiment of this guy was a true superhero. And I may say, with all sincerity, he was taller, more handsome, and just more charming in life than even the wonderfulness that you see on screen. And he was just a great guy. So I've always had like a really good sort of connection to Superman.
Did you ever read the comic, or?
I actually did. My brother was a huge comic book fan and had a lot of big, huge, like, white boxes of comics, and he had a lot of Superman comics and Wonder Woman comics. So those I would kind of borrow from him, and I would read those. And these were, like, the older issues from the 50s, so it was, like, you know, old-fashioned stories, but still, like, really, really interesting because it was, like, Superman going on adventures. I also listened to the Superman radio show with my dad. That was really interesting. And I also remember when I was little watching the George Reeves black and white TV show. So I have, like, a broad experience of Superman.
He's one of those characters that's just always been there, you know, just always a part of pop culture.
Exactly, yeah.
And for me, even the same with the movie. I remember growing up in the early 80s, there was like this kind of new pantheon of classics that was always there. There was Raiders of the Lost Ark, 2001, Star Wars, of course, and this. I can never remember a point where Superman wasn't always kind of somewhere in the background. And beyond the movies, of course, there was the old Super Friends cartoon show. That's kind of the Superman I grew up with in my head. I never really read the comics. I was always more of a Marvel person, but it was always just there, that character. All right, so the movie was released on December 15th, 1978 by Warner Brothers. Filmed for a budget of $55 million and had a box office take of over $300 million. Of course, based on the comics character created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And had previously been brought to the screen in a serial series with Kirk Allen, as well as the George Reeves television program, The Adventures of Superman, and we'd see a whole bunch of different versions after, as we'll get into. And of course, right at the center of it, you have Christopher Reeve as Kal-El, Clark Kent, Superman, and I mean, let's face it, the movie doesn't work without him. I mean, even with all these amazing actors and all the special effects, it all comes down to Christopher Reeve.
It's hard to imagine now anybody else but Christopher Reeve. I have the Blu-ray set with all the screen tests of different people. Like, I think at one point there was somebody's dentist who was doing a screen test.
Yeah, it was the producer's wife's dentist.
Yeah, who was just like, oh my god. Like, they were looking high and low.
Speaking of some of the other actors that were considered, among them were James Caan, Paul Newman, Robert Redford, Burt Reynolds. I can't imagine Burt Reynolds Superman.
No, absolutely not.
And supposedly when he first got the job, Richard Donner scribbled down Nick Nolte as a possibility.
Oh, wow. No.
The casting director, Lynn Stallmaster, had seen Reeves' audition and kept putting it to the top of the list even though the producers weren't interested, and he held out. It's really good that he did, because he's perfect.
Yeah. He just embodied the character, and he brings a sense of fun to it.
But also, he does the impossible. He makes being decent and good seem cool, which is very, very rare. I mean, so many of these heroes in these movies are kind of tough or glib or sarcastic, and he's never that. He's always very earnest and honest and decent and very polite. A friend of mine pointed out that unlike Batman, who will have a conversation with you and just take off and disappear on you, Superman's always like, hello, good evening, thank you, goodbye. There's no irony or camp or anything like that. Like his great speech about when he's asked, what is he here for?
Why are you here? There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes, I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
You're going to end up fighting every elected official in this country.
Sure you don't really mean that, Lois?
I don't believe this.
Lois?
Hmm?
I never lie.
It's almost as if she, embodying the audience, is like, whoa, wait a minute, we're not used to this. We're not used to a hero. Because especially coming out of the 70s where, like, the big thing was, like, Dirty Harry and these anti-heroes who had this sort of moral ambiguity, Superman had no ambiguity whatsoever. He was strictly on the side of good.
And you can see how it would be very easily to take that into parody or camp. I mean, they could easily have been doing Adam West in the old Batman show. I love that show, but it's nice to see them take this seriously without changing it up. I mean, he's just as honest and good, but he's not playing it for laughs.
Yeah. Let me just take this moment and say that never in cinematic history has a Superman ever been so hot. Oh, good lord. I love this man. Thank you. Continue.
I'm hetero and I can't disagree with it, to be honest.
I mean, he's just charming, and he doesn't seem totally in love with himself. Like, he has this self-depreciating charm.
And he brings a sensitivity, and for a guy who's impervious to, bullets and everything, a vulnerability to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Something else about the character that Reeves brings is this wonderful humility. Like that great moment at the end when the warden says, we're safe thanks to you. And he's like, no, we're all on the same team.
Right.
He's putting
Very
himself
inclusive.
at the same level as this guy. And then you come to him playing Clark Kent, and it's a completely different, not completely different, but there's a real different physicality to it, a different way that he speaks and moves, all the weird nervous tics, like him constantly adjusting his glasses, the little slump that he has where he's not quite as tall. Supposedly he based a lot of it on Cary Grant, and you can see that kind of the bringing up baby era Cary Grant comedic performance.
His Clark Kent is just as important as his Superman. and the way that he's able to balance those characters out equally. Because I think a lot of the later films, in some ways, shortchange Clark over Superman, because, everybody, they think, well, all the kids are going to be interested in the superhero. And what we're really interested in isn't necessarily the superhero, but the human behind the superhero,
I also like going back to Lois's reaction to the Truth, Justice, American Way thing. We see the same thing when Clark is talking about his mother.
Excuse me, Mr. White. I was wondering if perhaps you could arrange for half my salary to be sent to this address on a weekly basis.
Your bookie, right?
A what?
Don't tell me. He sends a check every week to his sweet gray-haired old mother.
Actually, she's silver-haired.
Any more at home like you?
Not really, no.
And she kind of does a double take, like, oh, he's serious. He's actually this guy that he seems to be on the outside. It's a nice little parallel that, as whether he's Superman or Clark, he's not putting anything on. It's completely serious. And then there's the kind of odd two-sided love triangle between Superman, Lois, and Clark that's interesting, where he seems to be really trying to date her as Clark when he could just sweep in as Superman if he wanted to and sweep her off her feet. But he still keeps kind of playing both of those, and I think that's really interesting.
I think that he, in some ways, feels that Clark is closer to who he is. That Superman is kind of like the disguise, but Clark is, in actuality, the person that he is.
There's also the fact that as Superman, let's face it, he is overwhelming. He doesn't want to put himself above anybody else, but it's kind of hard not to do that when you're Superman. So maybe as Clark, he feels it could be a little bit more of an even playing field. And it's hard to believe watching this again that Reeve had only been in one movie before this, but he really knows how to work the camera so well. All the tiny little subtle nuances of his performance, he is a film actor right out of the gate.
Yeah, definitely.
Next, we have Margot Kidder as Lois Lane. And I don't know if she gets a lot of the credit that she deserves. She's so much fun in these. And this feels like a character that could easily be abrasive and kind of unpleasant, but she plays it just right.
She has a very charming quality that I think dovetails nicely with what Christopher Reeve brought to his role. You can see why Clark and Superman would be interested in this woman, because one, she's playing in this sort of, boys' game of hard-hitting journalism, and she has a lot of ambition, but she's not like stepping on people to get to the top. She is willing to work hard. She's willing to put in the hours, and she's willing to really, pound the pavement and get the big stories.
Well, so I was wondering if maybe you'd like to have a little dinner with me.
Oh, gosh, Clark, I'm sorry, I'm booked.
Oh.
Yeah, Air Force One's landing at the airport, and this kid's gonna be there to make sure that you know. Good night! Who answers a few questions he'd rather duck?
My goodness, don't you ever let up?
What for? I've seen how the other half lives. My sister, for instance. 3 kids, 2 cats, and 1 mortgage.
Yeah!
I like that the movie doesn't punish her for her attitude that she's confident in her job. She's all about her job. We see her mind is always working. Whenever we see her at, I almost called the Daily Bugle. And whenever we see her at the Daily Planet, she's constantly kind of messing up all these other little things. She's so focused on whatever store she's going on. Bad speller. The scene where she's interviewing the guy in the car, he has to point out to her, look at the road before they crash. And even with her interactions with people, she's a little short with Clark here and there. She's short with Jimmy or whatever. She's just focused on the job. And it feels like another movie would bring her down a peg or make her forced to learn that there's other things other than the job.
Or make her like a man-hating, I have to make my way in a man's world, and no man's going to beat me down and stuff. But Lois doesn't have that. She's just very focused on the job at hand, doing the best that she absolutely can, getting the story out, and just being the best reporter that she can.
And she's fine that way. And the movie acknowledges she's okay that way. Mm-hmm. And there's the great shift in attitude whenever she's around Superman, where all that kind of bluster and confidence and drive kind of drops away, and she's basically a little kid, like a fan in front of a celebrity. She's like, oh my God. But again, not in a way that's cloying or anything. It's really adorable and sweet. In addition to being smart and hardworking, she's also brave to the point of being foolhardy, like that scene with the mugger where any rational person would just hand over the purse and let him go, but no, she has to try and kick the gun out of the way and take control of the situation.
Yeah, and you can even hear Clark going like, Lois, what are you doing?
It feels kind of classic in a way. A lot of her character feels like, say, like Rosalind Russell and His Girl Friday, sort of this 1940s idea of the intrepid, brave reporter, which kind of goes back to the origins of Superman from the 1930s.
Yeah,
so.
It has the definite screwball comedy sense about it.
And yet merging that with the modern time, so it doesn't feel anachronistic. It just feels like it's got a flavor of this and a flavor of that kind of blended together just right.
Right, like that scene where she and Clark are working out, and she's like, so how was your first day? And he's like, oh yeah, I thought it was swell. And she's like, swell? And then she says one of my favorite lines, Clark, I don't think a lot of people would be comfortable saying the word swell. Not that people would, don't say that anymore, would be comfortable saying swell, and it was just, it's just a great line.
It's not mean-spirited, it's almost like, here, let me help you.
Yeah,
You don't want to say this
exactly.
word now. It's like she's trying to help him merge with the modern world a little bit better.
Right.
Among those who were almost cast in the part were Leslie Ann Warren, Ann Archer, and Stockard Channing was the other runner-up for the role. And we have one of the real big headliners for the movie, Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor. Like Brando, he's very heavily touted in the advertising. It's kind of goes back to Jack Nicholson as the Joker being credited above Michael Keaton as Batman. The villain gets the credit over the hero, but by this point, he had done Bonnie and Clyde, he had won his Oscar for The French Connection, Poseidon Adventure, The Conversation. I mean, he was not only a star, but he was an actor's actor. He was a real dramatic actor. And yet he comes in here, and beyond his little cameo in Young Frankenstein, he hadn't done a lot of comedy, and he's just having a ball with this role. And it's really neat to see him having so much fun with it.
Yeah, I especially love his chemistry with Ned Beatty. Never have I seen villain and henchman sort of more, like Lex absolutely loathes Otis, but like keeps him around to do the dirty work. And Otis is just like this little puppy who's just like, oh, yep, got that, Mr. Luthor.
Well, Ned Beatty
it's adorable.
Yeah, Ned Beatty has the same thing where he was this big dramatic actor. I mean, he had done like Deliverance and All the President's Men and Network, and he's so much fun here. I as a kid, always thought of him as a comedic actor because of seeing him in this.
Right.
And yeah, you look at it and go, all right, why does this master criminal keep this complete dimwit around? But I think it speaks to Luthor's character that he needs somebody this idiotic around him so he can feel that much smarter.
Exactly.
He's always touting himself as this absolutely perfect mastermind genius. And while we find out later on, okay, he is pretty clever, he's also kind of an idiot, too.
Yeah, no,
So.
He's not as smart as he thinks he is, at all.
How do you choose to congratulate the greatest criminal mind of our time? Huh? Do you tell me that I'm brilliant? Oh, no. That would be too obvious. I grant you. Charismatic. Fiendishly gifted.
Try twisted. Tell me something, Lex. Why do so many people have to die for the crime of the century?
Why? You ask why? Why does the phone always ring when you're in the bathtub? Why is the most brilliantly diabolical leader of our time surrounding himself with total nincompoops? I'm back, Mr. Luthor. Yes, I was just talking about you.
And I love Beatty is constantly trying to impress him and trying to show off, oh no, I'm smart too. You watch any scene with the two of them, you're usually watching Hackman, but if you watch some of the stuff Ned Beatty is doing, some of the little bits of physical comedy, I never noticed until we just watched it that when Hackman has that pithy line about how somebody can look at a chewing gum wrapper and learn the secrets of the universe, in the very next cut you see Otis opening up his chewing gum wrapper and trying to read it, trying to figure something out. Something else about I like that while he is played for laughs in so much of the first half of the movie, it is kind of a little bit of a sucker punch when we realize in the second half he's going to kill thousands and thousands of people, and he's cheery about it.
And it almost makes his character that much more sinister, because he can be so happy and cheery about it. Like when Superman says,
Is that how a warped brain like yours gets its kicks? By planning the death of innocent people?
No. By causing the death of innocent people.
and he's very honest about it, and it almost makes you feel that chill much more because he's just so matter-of-fact about it.
He's so disconnected. I mean, he talks about how he'd quite willingly kill Otis if it helped him out in his scheme. He has such a dim view of the rest of humanity that they are completely expendable in his eyes. Anybody around him. He doesn't have anyone that we see in the movie that he's not willing to kill if it comes down to it. Besides Hackman, the other big name in the cast, of course, was Marlon Brando as Jor-El. It's funny you hear about the millions that he got for this for only being in, 5 or 10 minutes of the movie. And yet, when you're watching them, he is really good. He does really bring this, I hesitate to use the word gravitas, but this real quality to the movie that tells you that, yes, we're taking this seriously. Marlon Brando is in this. He's not playing it for laughs. He is taking this as seriously as he would Last Tango in Paris or On the Waterfront. And it sets a nice tone for the rest of the movie, those first scenes with him there.
Yeah, like you were talking about earlier with sort of the camp attitude. The tagline of the movie is, "You will believe a man can fly." And so to have, great actors such as Gene Hackman and, of course, Marlon Brando in your movie, it raises the level up and gives a sense of, okay, this is kind of on the same page as a Shakespearean drama. It's not just a guy in tights. And I think in their choice to have all British actors, apart from Brando, as the Kryptonians, even Marlon, he doesn't speak with so much of an English accent, but he does speak with a very senatorial accent, very sort of statesman-esque.
It's suicide. No, it's worse. It's genocide.
Be warned, Jor-El.
The Council has already evaluated this outlandish theory of yours. My friends, you know me to be neither rash nor impulsive. I'm not given to wild, unsupported statements. And I tell you that we must evacuate this planet immediately.
I think that if the planet was not going to blow up and Kal-El had stayed with Jor-El and Lara, I don't think that maybe you would have gotten the full relationship that they had, you know, in death. I think that maybe Jor-El would have been, well, a loving father, still more of a closed-off figure, would not have been able to maybe express emotion as much as he was able to do because of the fact that he was basically a recording on a crystal. There's that lovely scene after Superman kind of outs himself to the world and he goes on his sort of night of, like, saving the president, rescuing cats from trees, and putting a huge boat in the middle of middle of the street in Metropolis. Well, yeah, it's like that's a little, for my Superman, that's a little inconsiderate because how are they gonna get that boat out of the middle of the
picture like
street?
The police and the tow truck guys. Yeah, great, thanks Superman.
Yeah, exactly.
Good job.
You know, yeah, like,
we have a marina, you know.
Yeah, like thanks Superman. But you have this scene where you kind of get Jor-El being like, you know, I saw this day coming. I knew that you were going to do this. You have to be careful. But it's almost like he says, in his way, I'm very proud of you, and I wish I was there to embrace you as my son. And you see Superman hold out his hands almost without thinking, just to have that moment of connection to his father. And he looks at his hands and he realizes that he can never have that. But I don't think maybe you would have gotten that sort of lovely connection. It's almost as if a layer of distance had to be put on that relationship for it to grow to its full potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course Brando was famous for never memorizing scripts but just reading his lines off cue cards.
In the scene where he's putting the baby in the thing, what you don't see is the baby's actually wearing a diaper and he has his lines written on the kid's diaper. It's just okay. There's another story that Richard Donner tells on the DVD when he goes to talk to Marlon about the character of Jor-El, and Marlon tells him, well, you know, I've always seen Jor-El as, you know, he's an alien. He can be anything. So what about if he's just like this big green bagel? And he was so sincere about it that like Donner did not know, like, is this guy for real? What have I done? I've just agreed to pay this guy millions of dollars and he wants to be a goddamn green bagel in my movie. I think part of it was not that he was trying to be a jerk. I think he honestly wanted to keep that sense of, you know, people as they're talking, they don't know what they're going to say. Mm-hmm. As they're talking, they're trying to figure out words. And I think that he wanted to maybe keep that rhythm, to keep that sense of truth, where he's like, you know, I don't want to memorize what I'm going to say. I want to be able to look and see and then add, you know, the feeling and emotion to it.
Give it the spontaneity, yeah.
Right, exactly. Or he just didn't want to be arsed to learn the lines.
Well, I mean, he's always done this. I remember there's stills of him on the set of The Godfather with Robert Duvall having cue cards taped to his stomach with all the lines. And speaking of, I keep thinking in the opening scene when he has the trial for Zod that he's going to turn around and he's going to have the cat from The Godfather and just be petting it. This is no fantasy, no.
There's a scene where Zod is talking and he kind of is stroking the rod, and the way that he looks at Terrence Stamp is like, bitch, if you don't stop talking, I'm going to hit you with this rod. And it's just like, oh, snap, okay.
Oh, see, that's the thing we never got to see, the Brando, Terrence Stamp full-on throwdown.
The smackdown, you know? Yeah.
And casting Brando in this part would kind of continue a tradition that we actually see upheld on the Earth scenes of this, where you get a really big-name actor to play kind of the parental figure mentor of the hero. So we have Glenn Ford playing Jonathan Kent, and it's the same thing. You have this very classy, distinguished actor. And Ford only has 2 scenes, but he's so good in them. He sets such a tone for this character, and as a result for Clark and Clark's development in those 2 scenes.
Yeah, he's only in those 2 scenes, but my God, those 2 scenes are humdingers. Like the scene where they find Clark in the ship. And just the way that Glenn Ford, like, is talking to his wife, and he's like, you know, Martha, I don't even want to hear what you're thinking. We can't take this kid that we find on the side of the road. And she's like, well, we could say he's my cousin's and recently orphaned.
And there are those great subtle hints that he adds in as to the backstory with that, you know, Martha, don't start, or later on in his speech to Clark.
When you first came to us, we thought that people would come and take you away because when they found out, you know, the things you could do, and that worried us a lot. But then a man gets older and he thinks very differently, and things get very clear. And there's one thing I do know, son, and that is you are here for a reason. I don't know whose reason, whatever the reason is, you know. Maybe it's because, I don't know. It's,
And he never finishes the thought, but you always get this sense of they wanted to have kids and couldn't for whatever reason.
Right.
And that this has been an ongoing thing with them of how much they wanted children. And so when finally he shows up, it's perfect. They have the child that they can raise as their own. That does bring up one issue that I have, and it's not just with this, it comes up with other interpretations of Superman. So much of it is Jor-El imparting his wisdom and everything to Clark when he escapes in the ship, and Glenn Ford gets to have his speech imparting his wisdom. It feels like the mother characters kind of get shortchanged.
They do.
Susanna York as Lara, her main thing is to kind of be skeptical of the idea of sending him to Earth and carrying little baby Kal-El around. That's really it. And poor Phyllis Thaxter, her big contribution is to make sure that the box of Cheerios is just in frame so that General Mills can get their money's worth for the ad placement.
Yeah, and it echoes back to a line that Lara says where she's like, why are you sending him to Earth? He will be an outcast. He will be alone. And Jor-El says, he will never be alone. I will always be with him. Totally ignoring Lara, by the way. But
you'll be fondly remembered. But
yeah, I mean, him, yeah. You just birthed the kid. I put all these crystals together. Thanks, dear.
You know how long this ship took to put together?
Yeah, exactly. She's like, you know how long it took for this kid to be born? Seriously, Jor-El, what the hell?
Who did the diapers? Who did the multicolored diapers?
You know? You have to look at the sense of time when these films were made, and especially in the comic book canon, the focus on the father-son relationship.
Let's move on to Jackie Cooper playing Perry White, and it's interesting because he was not the original choice for the character. Keenan Wynn had actually been cast and had flown to the set and then suffered heart trouble as soon as he landed and just couldn't take the part. And so Cooper was the guy who had availability and a passport to travel to England, and so he was cast. He's a lot of fun. I mean, he is kind of the classic old-fashioned newspaper editor barking orders and stuff. He's not quite as mean-spirited as J. Jonah Jameson, but he is a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's definitely that great line where he's like,
Lois, Clark Kent may seem like just a mild-mannered reporter, but listen, not only does he know how to treat his editor-in-chief with the proper respect, not only does he have a snappy, punchy prose style, but he is, in my 40 years in this business, the fastest typist I've ever seen.
And it's just like, Perry has his priorities.
Well, but also the line right before it where he's like, and not only does he respect his editor,
yeah.
and you can see Lois kind of give this, all right. And you see it in his interactions with Jimmy Olsen, too, where Jimmy's like, I wasn't going to say it. You get the sense that Perry White takes a lot of crap from his employees.
Yeah.
And yet he keeps them around. So he's a good boss, but he's always just slightly exasperated.
He's always, right on the edge of having, a nervous breakdown or having, a really bad stomach attack. I think you see him in, either in part 1 or part 2, taking in acids, downing in acids, because he's just so, I can't take you people anymore.
I think if everything went right and he got,
he met
deadlines and everything was terrific, he'd be depressed.
Yeah,
he's one of those.
Couldn't deal with it.
You hear that a lot with newspaper people, how they'd always have to be that adrenaline junkie.
Because that's when you do your best work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And next is Valerie Prin as Miss Tesmacher. And she almost feels like she's sort of the counterpoint to Lex the same way Lois is sort of the counterpoint to Superman.
Right.
That she's there to sort of be impressed, or in her case, not be impressed by Lex, and sort of meet the audience point of view.
Yeah, she's in league with Lex, but she also has this sense of some of the stuff that you're doing, buddy, it's not kosher.
She also kind of points up how ridiculous he is at points, too.
Oh, yeah. There's even at one point she says, and oh God, this is such a 1977 line, she's like, I might get hit in the mouth for this, and I'm like, ooh, okay. Yeah, I don't think you can get away with that nowadays. But she still has the courage to speak her mind. And then, of course, there's the whole lovely relationship with her and Superman when she saves him from the kryptonite.
Why did you kiss me first?
I didn't think you'd let me later.
Thank you, Miss Tesmacher.
Why is it I can't get it on with the good guys?
If fan fiction had been around back in the 70s, I think a lot of fan fiction would have been written about Superman and Miss Tesmacher.
I totally see that.
Because, don't get me wrong, I'm fully Lois Clark, Lois Superman, but I would love expanded universe where Superman and Tesmacher, went off.
When Superman went bad in Superman 3, forget about Pamela Stevenson, you should have gotten together with Miss Tesmacher for a little something.
I think that she's not as bad as she thinks she is. Mm-hmm. She wants to be bad, I think she wants to see herself as like this
gangster mall.
Yeah, this
sort
person.
of along for the ride, yeah.
But in reality, she's still that girl from that small town who cares about her mom. And so the chips fall down more on the side of good than bad.
I didn't realize that when you think about it. She is one of the most important characters of the movie in that sense. If she didn't help Superman, Lois is gone, Jimmy's gone, California falls in the sea, Lex wins. She is kind of the pivoting point for everything in that last third act.
Very attractive woman. But unlike a lot of beautiful women in comedy, she doesn't play on just her looks. She also uses her intelligence, and she uses this great comedic timing, and she nails it.
This is one case where it's good that the Salkinds were a little thrifty with their pricing, because originally Richard Donner wanted either Anne Margaret or Goldie Hawn to play the part, and they wouldn't meet their asking price. So I think it's kind of a good thing in a way.
Yeah.
Because Prynne, she's just perfect as that character.
Exactly.
Filling out the Daily Planet bullpen, we have Mark McClure playing Jimmy Olsen. And again, he feels like a character right out of the 1950s, right down to the bow tie and the often disgusting suit jackets that he's wearing. And I like that he's sort of the friendlier face of the office to Clark Kent. He's the one that we see welcoming Clark Kent around and always trying to be nice and pleasant to him, and you can see how that kind of friendship from the comics develops here.
In the movies, they give Jimmy sort of more to do. He's not just like the coffee boy or the edit boy. He has more of a personality. And I have to admit, my favorite performance of him as Jimmy is actually in Supergirl.
Oh, yeah, he's...
Yeah, where he dates, unbeknownst to anyone, and I think Lois would be really ticked off if she knew, he dates Lucy Lane, who is Lois's baby sister.
He's actually the only actor to appear in all of the Salkind continuity of Superman movies, yeah. And then there's Terrence Stamp as General Zod.
Even though in the first film he only has a very, very small scene in the beginning where it's him and Jor-El. Basically, when he comes back for part 2, you already know so much about this character. 1, he's badass. 2, he's a megalomaniac. 3, he's insane. 4, he has great fashion sense. I mean, first of all, he's wearing thigh-high leather boots. Perfect. And absolutely perfect.
As per the 1970s, not afraid to show off the chest hair either.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I am going to say something slightly controversial here.
Okay.
I think that if the Salkinds had been willing to pay for all of the Brando scenes for part 2, I think it would have been better to take this out of part 1 and just have it as a flashback at the beginning of part 2.
Well, that was the original intent.
Just because, I guess the original intent was to keep it here, and then them being released from the Phantom Zone would have been a cliffhanger at the end of it. The missile that Superman drives off into space would have hit the Phantom Zone, it would have been the tag, and then come back for Superman 2, and then credits. The problem is that Stamp sets such a tone with his acting, it kind of casts a pall over the movie a little bit, because you want him to come back for so much of the movie, because he's so good in that one scene. Hackman's a great villain, but you really want to see this character. You want to see Superman fight this guy, and we have to wait for the next movie to do that, so I almost wish they could have moved that into the beginning of part 2 and just kept it there, because they kind of reprised this scene there anyway. They just couldn't afford the Marlon Brando footage. But in 2 or 3 minutes, just the menace dripping off of this guy.
In that small scene where he starts screaming, you can see not only the rage, but the fear in his face, because he knows what's coming, of like absolute demonic, I will make you bow down before me. And it's a total reaction to this thing is coming for me and I can't escape it. So I will make sure that if I'm living in fear, you will live in fear as well.
I offer you a chance for greatness, Jor-El. Take it. Join us. You will bow down before me, Jor-El. I swear it. No matter that it takes an eternity, you will bow down before me. Both you and then one day, your heirs.
But it's also interesting to see him in contrast to the Kryptonian society we do see. That's a little high-minded, but also kind of arrogant and locked in on itself, and can't really see other possibilities, as we see when they dismiss Jor-El's point of view. You can almost see how somebody like Zod would spring out of this, that he's frustrated with these snobby people around him, and thinks he can jump into the void there and try and take control.
It's an atmosphere that breeds contempt.
The last name we'll talk about is Jeff East, who plays young Clark. East you might remember from horror movies like Deadly Blessing and Pumpkinhead. And I feel bad for him because he had to wear prosthetics so he'd look more like Christopher Reeve, and on the DVD and Blu-ray, you can really see there's a little discoloration around, so they could give him Christopher Reeve's nose. That appliance is just a little off from the skin tone. And then, after the fact, his entire vocal performance is stripped out and he's dubbed over by Christopher Reeve. There's only one instance where you can hear his voice, and when he jumps in front of the train and does that woohoo, that's his actual voice. But considering all that, he's really good in the few scenes that he has. Kind of gets a lot of the emotional burden of Clark's development, the loss of his father, trying to figure out who he is, this quest to find his identity. Although he seems like kind of a handsome dude. I couldn't picture him being quite the nerd that he's depicted to be among the Smallville High students.
That's the thing that I never got. Like, Clark always kind of came across to me from the flashback scenes in this one. Why wouldn't the girls, like, be all over him? I think maybe it has to do with the high school pecking order and the fact that Clark couldn't be on the football team and Clark couldn't be really involved in sports. So he had to put on this persona that he wasn't really interested in it. You know, maybe they spread the story around school, around town, that, like, Clark had weak lungs or something and he couldn't play sports. And I think that it kind of diminished him in a lot of people's eyes. And it kind of irritated Clark a lot because he knew, I literally can kick a football to the next town. And I can run faster than your car and meet you there before you get there. And all the girls are impressed. And he's like, yeah, woohoo, I'm the shit.
See, it's kind of a shame that Clark didn't come along later. In the 60s, he could have had a guitar and been like the moody musician type. He could have been a goth later on.
Being a jock didn't matter so much.
There was so many other groups that he could have bonded with a couple years down the road. In the 50s, it didn't seem like there was like nerd and jock, and that was pretty much it.
Pretty much.
Besides all the major roles, there's some interesting cameos. You have Trevor Howard and Maria Schell popping up as some of the Kryptonian elders, and one of my favorites, although he doesn't have any dialogue, it's Ian Chesterton himself. William Russell is one of the Kryptonian scientists, so Doctor Who fans, keep an eye out for him.
Woohoo!
Larry Hagman as the army major who's hauling the missile, who has that great little scene where he decides he's going to apply first aid himself to Valerie Prin, just to show the troops how it's done.
A vigorous chest massage.
We have Kirk Allen and Noel Neill popping up as Lois Lane's parents on the train when she sees Clark running by in the extended edition. They were the first actors to play Lois and Clark in the early Superman serials. And, of course, Rex Reed as himself.
Every time I see him in this film now, I just have flashes of Maya Breckenridge in my head. And I'm just like, God, make it stop.
Getting to the crew of the movie, of course, the director is Richard Donner, who had just come off of doing The Omen. Might have seemed like an odd choice in that sense, although that was kind of a blockbuster too. But from that movie that's so dark and grim, he makes this one so playful and fun with, again, not turning it into a parody, that he does take it seriously and just finds just that right tone. And this movie, along with Jaws and Star Wars, I think, is sort of that transition point from the gritty and moody 70s movies into the 80s, where everything is a lot more fun and pop and blockbuster and a little bit more fantastic.
Yeah, I definitely get that sense. It was definitely the first kind of comic book movie. And the great thing about Donner is that he builds a world, and you feel like you're fully immersed in it.
One thing I like also is that he does create that tone, but he also creates several different tones over the course of the movie. I mean, the movie starts out as this straight, very serious sci-fi opera in a way, that you have Krypton and Jor-El taken very seriously, no humor there, it's all very straight, almost Shakespearean drama. And then we switch over to Smallville, and it's this kind of Americana, where it's very big emotions, but very earnest and direct. And then once he goes to Metropolis, it becomes a little bit more of a modern movie, but it also really becomes the superhero movie. The tone is sort of realistic, but also kind of heightened and fun. And just to mash all these three together, but make it all have this consistent journey from A to B to C. And that really is a tribute to him. I do like Superman 2 a lot, but I don't know if it has that consistent tone the way this one does.
Definitely looking back at 2's production history, you could kind of get the sense of where that might have fallen off a bit because they were filming 1 and 2 at the same time. Until, for cost reasons, they decided to just stop production on 2 and just focus on 1 so they could get that out into the theaters, make some money, and then go back and finish 2, and then, of course, the whole thing with Donner and the Salkinds.
Yeah, unfortunately, while they were making this, he was constantly harassed by the Salkinds about being over budget and over schedule, even though he never really got a specific budget or schedule, apparently. Right. And when he complained about it in public, he was fired and replaced with Richard Lester, who had been acting as a go-between for them during the production of it. But, like as you said, a lot of Superman 2 was directed by Richard Donner, even in the Richard Lester cut. And you can...
Yeah, Margot Kidder had said for years that Richard Donner had filmed over 70% of Superman 2, and that if they ever decided to release the footage, you would have basically a whole movie. And so back in 2000, I think 8 or 9, they found the footage and decided to produce the Richard Donner cut.
The producers for the film were Ilya and Alexander Salkind and Pierre Spengler, who had all collaborated for the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers movies, and would later go on to Santa Claus the movie, where it seems like they took some lessons from this because that movie almost feels like a superhero origin story for Santa Claus.
The Salkinds had a little bit of a reputation for finagling things. When they produced Three Musketeers, they had signed on Michael York, Frank Finlay, Richard Chamberlain, Oliver Reed. Everybody who was cast was under the understanding that they would only be doing 1 film. they ended up filming so much footage that the Salkins decided to split it up between 2 films and only pay them for one. And the actors and the crew got together and basically had a mutiny and said, no, that's not going to happen. You're going to pay us for this other film. So the movie that was originally just supposed to be The Three Musketeers became The Three Musketeers and then The Four Musketeers.
And they had to change the rules after that, I'm
yes,
pretty
they
sure,
did.
as well. And
yeah. So the Salkins were never really on the up and up. I give them full marks and full credit for taking a chance. Like, nobody thought, when they tried to sell the idea of, we want to do a movie about Superman, everybody was like, good luck. That's not going to happen. It's not going to sell. You're not going to make any money. What are you trying to do? But they went with it, and it proves that they were right. But I just don't agree with a lot of their business practices.
I agree, and some of their tactics as producers did pay off. The idea, we'll get Marlon Brando to play Jor-El. Right. It seems kind of ridiculous, but it worked. It brought the film a lot of respect and legitimacy. And then we'll get Mario Puzo, who did The Godfather, to do the script for this. Then coming to that, I mean, Puzo wrote this 500-page script that was huge and dense and had the basic outline for the stories, but it was considered kind of unfilmable. Mm-hmm. And then they brought in David and Leslie Newman and Robert Benton to rewrite it. But Richard Donner gives most of the credit to Tom Mankiewicz, who came in and was refused credit by the WGA, but he gets the creative consultant credit right after the writing credits, which I guess Donner put it there on purpose to kind of thumb his nose at the WGA.
Exactly.
And he really does feel like, along with Donner, one of the real creative brains behind making this movie work as well as it does.
Yeah, the commentary track on the DVD between those two, it's just a fascinating font of information about the production, because you have like Tom Mankiewicz, who is this fantastic writer, comes from a line of great directors and writers, and of course you have the talents of Donner and them coming together, not only as the creative geniuses that they are, but also as buddies and friends who like totally had a great time working together, and they totally got one another.
And you can hear in that commentary that Mankiewicz remembers everything. He has a real mind for details.
Yeah.
And that comes in the script with how he'd have to layer in information. He has to work in the fact that Superman can't see through lead. Where do you put it in the movie where audiences will remember it? You put it into the interview scene. Or I love when Clark goes to the office and he's wondering where Lois and Jimmy are. And Perry White just happens to mention, oh, we have this crazy story here about a meteorite being robbed from this museum and 2 people killed. Who would do such a thing? Now we know exactly how Lex Luthor got the kryptonite from later on. Where another movie might spend a whole scene showing this robbery, he just throws in one little line and you get enough.
Exactly.
Also, the patience of the screenplay is really interesting. I mean, can you imagine a movie of this being made now where you'd spend this much time developing who Clark is before we even see him? It's 50 minutes before we see Christopher Reeve in the Superman outfit.
Oh, yeah.
And it's over an hour before Lex Luthor pops up, and even longer before we find out what he's doing. I don't think any superhero movie would have that patience to set up all this stuff.
No, not even a typical origin movie nowadays would sort of take the time to set that up. It would have like maybe the little prologue and then move right into setting up the story, but moving it very quickly with a lot of action points. I don't think...
Or doing the non-linear thing where we flash back and forth.
Yeah. I think the pacing in modern film has changed.
You'd never have a scene like Lois and Superman's flight that takes so long. I mean, that's a good 3 or 4 minute scene. It doesn't really build the plot, but it builds so much in terms of character and their love story. It's really important.
Exactly. I mean, without that scene, you really don't get the emotional impact of the scene at the end where Lois is dead and gone, and Superman literally, to save the woman that he loves, turns back the world. You know, without that flight scene, without that setting these two up, you don't get that emotional payoff later.
Let's move on to the cinematography of the movie by Jeffrey Unsworth, who unfortunately passed away right after finishing this, and the movie is dedicated to him. He had also photographed A Night to Remember, 2001 for Stanley Kubrick, A Bridge Too Far, and a lot of his work was in Superman 2. And he shoots the movie in this very distinctively diffused, soft manner that gives it this slightly unreal quality that I really like, almost a slightly dreamlike quality.
And a lot of it doesn't have that grittiness that you associate with a lot of films from the 70s. It has definitely sort of a golden hue on it. Like there's the great scene where Clark tells his mother that he's going to be leaving, and you have this great crane shot of them sort of hugging, and they're in the middle of a wheat field. Lovely light, this golden scene, and it's almost like a requiem for Clark's small town life. And it's just, I think, a beautiful transition scene.
It's funny, supposedly a huge blackout occurred in New York just as they were shooting the crowd reaction scenes to the helicopter scene. And it happened right after Unsworth had urged one of the grips to plug into the city's streetlight so he could get enough power for one more light. So Unsworth became convinced that he had caused the blackout.
Oh, that's
despite
awesome.
everyone telling him, no, it was something else. Like, oh, yeah, but we did plug in that one light. I think we also have to talk about the production design by John Barry. Barry had helped design A Clockwork Orange and, most importantly, Star Wars. And I think you can see a little bit of that influence here. And one thing I think is really important is his design of Krypton and the Fortress of Solitude, this great crystalline look to it. It's funny because I didn't really know Superman. I always assumed after this movie that that's what Krypton looked like. It wasn't until years later I realized that no, in the comics it's this really green, lush, beautiful world. Mm-hmm. But giving it that look, that cold, chilly look, I think really fits the characterization of the Kryptonians, that they are these kind of arrogant, distant people that don't really seem to have quite as much warmth. One other bit of design work that absolutely amazes me is Lex Luthor's subway lair. I absolutely love this. I mean, in any James Bond movie, you see the villain has this ridiculously ornate hideaway, and you're wondering, why? Who are they trying to impress with this? Nobody would get to see it. Here it makes perfect sense that Luthor has somehow found this abandoned subway train station and decided, this will work, and subverts it to his own ends. The little stairway down to the restaurants becomes his pool. He has this one room that becomes sort of his library. You can see all the details of what this building was before Luthor got to it.
Yeah,
and
there's that great scene where you have Miss Tessmacher sort of sunning herself with the heat lamps on this made-up beach where they have like rear projection showing, the setting sun and the palm trees, and it's just, honestly, I would live in a place like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Come on, I mean, it's fantastic. 300 feet below ground? Okay, sure, no problem. But the production design in this film, it again sort of gives a lushness to it. Almost in a lot of like costume dramas, you get that sense of lushness, that sense of detail, and for the first time, that sense of detail and that just total like abandonment of like, okay, we're going to do this the right way. And this was a way of going about things that inspired a lot of costume designers and a lot of production designers later on. The first thought that comes to my head is the Lord of the Rings movies. Mm-hmm. That, like, fanatical attention to detail.
Yeah.
And I think Superman was definitely one of those first films that was like, you can use that in a fantastical setting.
And sets like the Daily Bugle, I can't want to call it the Daily Bugle, the Daily Planet newsroom, where it's, again, this nice merging of something classic we might have seen from newspaper dramas of the 50s, this open floor plan with the glass windows and everybody can kind of see everybody. But it also has a little bit of, like, the Washington Post from All the President's Men. That merging of the reality with the fantasy in this nice combination that feels real, but also feels more exciting than the reality would be. Let's move on to another really huge factor in the success of this movie, the music by John Williams. Because, oh my god, you cannot hear that main theme without just getting stirred up. The low horn notes that slowly build up into the big fanfare.
The notes that actually say it, Superman. It goes, bum, ba da ba bum, bum, ba da. And it's like, it's arguably one of the most famous pieces of film score. And John Williams, hits it out of the park with the Kryptonian theme, the love theme,
the villain's theme, that great comedic line.
Yeah. One of my favorite pieces of music is during that scene of Superman finding Lois in the car, and when he's laying her down, this sad little twinkling of music. It's almost going over Clark's realization that, oh my god, Lois is gone. And
then little motifs he comes up with, like he takes a little portion of the Superman theme and makes it sound a little sinister for the crystal. Whenever the little green crystal pops up, that dun 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 dun. Or the great little drum bass motif he comes up with for General Zod that's used a ton in Superman 2, readapted there. All these little elements that have these great themes that all blend together. I mean, the love theme is so simple and terrific, and it fits right into the main theme, too.
Yeah, exactly. Even the the lovely song that Lois does, the Can You Read My Mind, that piece, even with Margot Kidder's like talking over it, still one of my favorite pieces of music because it has this lovely operatic, just lush theme. It just really expresses like the emotion that these two characters are feeling, their joy in sort of, meeting each other and flirting with each other and just connecting. And it's this wonderful music accompaniment to this relationship.
I would have been curious to hear, because originally Kidder had sung those lyrics rather than said them.
I've heard it, and it is not good.
I know there was a single later on sung by Maureen McGovern. But the disco-y one, yeah.
I have heard the Margot Kidder sung version. I think it's on YouTube. Not good. I love Margot Kidder, but singing was not her forte.
I don't really think it fits the scene either. If you're just
No,
saying the words,
absolutely
works
not.
great.
Yeah.
It allows her to express more of a vulnerability that I think she would have been able
Right.
to if she were singing.
And it also kind of reads to the way she's asked, can you read my mind? And it's almost like, can he? Well, he can do all this other stuff, you know. You can look at her underwear. I mean, you know.
All right, let's talk about the special effects. Because, of course, one of the big selling points of this movie was You'll Believe a Man Can Fly. And boy, they had trouble getting that right.
Oh, yeah.
They tried animation. They tried launching little models of Christopher Reeve out of cannons. And I think they actually used a couple of those for some shots, because there's a couple that look like little miniatures. And finally, it came down to doing a lot of blue screen, but especially putting Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder in front of, like, projection screens. And those shots, I mean, you know how they're done, but they still work really well. There's one right after he rescues her in the helicopter, and we cut to him flying over the city, and then we realize he's upside down, and then it spins around for him to come right side up, and then banks to the side. It's such a beautiful shot.
Yeah. Donner had said that with Christopher, he didn't have to teach him that. Like, Christopher was doing all this physical stuff with the flying, banking, and using his arms, and just sort of really getting into it and making you believe, like, oh my god, there's a science to it. He's using aerodynamics, and it just made it that much more believable than just sort of putting your arms straight out.
Right, the George Reeves style.
Yeah.
Now I always picture Superman with one arm out, kind of steering
Right.
himself with that arm. Additionally, for special effects, there's Derek Meddings and the model work, because there's a ton of great models in this. Some, like the bit with the Hoover Dam, you can't really scale for water, so it doesn't totally work. But the Kryptonian landscapes are absolutely beautiful.
The Fortress of Solitude.
The Fortress of Solitude is another great one. When Clark gets there and throws the crystal, I kept expecting Santa's workshop from Santa Claus the Movie to pop up and Patch and the Elves to show up.
True.
We've been waiting for you. Oh, no, wrong one.
No, wrong
Sorry,
one.
never mind.
And then you had Dudley Moore going,
But, I mean, when you get to the Golden Gate Bridge one, with all the cables dropping onto the cars, that's gorgeous looking. That really has a sense of mass and scale to it.
Exactly, and such detail too, and such a tribute to Derek Meddings. He was just a master at his craft. Worked on one of the last great Bond films, GoldenEye.
And his work on the first Batman movie, all of the Gotham City models he did, still looks incredible.
Just brilliant work, and unfortunately kind of a lost art nowadays with
It
the
is,
reliance on CGI.
One thing about Superman, it's unavoidable. You can't get away from a lot of the biblical metaphor in it. And I think a lot of versions of it, especially after this, have gone a little too far at that. I mean, how many Superman movies, whether it's Bryan Singer's or Zack Snyder, you have endless shots of Superman in the crucifix position over the earth. And it's just like, okay, we get it. I love that with this movie where you have the backstory, which is very God sending Jesus to earth or Moses being sent down the river, that they don't feel they need to go further than that. They don't have to do a lot of the visual stuff. That moment in Man of Steel when he's in the church and talking about his problems and Jesus is right over his shoulder in the stained glass, it's like, all right,
It's
enough.
like, okay, the metaphor is literally taking a hammer and hitting you over the head with it.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, it's totally too much. And one of the great things about Donner and his very light touch with the directing is that it's already there. You don't need to be hit over the head with it. It's in the fine print.
You get it.
It does the one thing that you always do in great fiction, great filmmaking. It shows, not tells.
Mm-hmm.
It shows. It already automatically perceives that you've made the connection.
And if not, if you don't make the connection or don't want to, you don't have to. It's
Right.
not there. It's a science fiction movie then. Krypton is not heaven. Jor-El's not
No.
God. It's fine. You don't need it.
But it does do what Star Wars did, was it takes these great tropes, not just in biblical stories, but also in just myth and legend. So you have those archetypes that your brain picks up on it, even if it's not shown blatantly to you.
Weren't the two guys who created Superman for the comics actually Jewish?
Yes.
Which, that adds a really interesting wrinkle to it.
Yeah.
There's also the value of Superman as a role model in the 1970s. I mean, that we were coming out of this post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era where everyone is very cynical. There wouldn't seem to be really a place for this optimistic flying Boy Scout. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important, not only as a movie, but as a character. And we can see it in Lois and Perry White and Lex Luthor, how all their attitudes. Lex Luthor is very dismissive of society and people. People are no damn good. Lois is not hard-bitten, but very cynical and always looking for kind of the darker edge for her stories. Perry White is always about promoting the paper, and his whole thing about finding Superman and making him a partner, he wants him associated with the Daily Planet. And Superman's presence sort of opens them up, I think, a little bit to this optimism, this idea that truth, justice, and the American way it isn't just kind of a catchphrase. It's something that's worth fighting for.
And it's kind of similar to a lot of sort of political rhetoric over the past 30 or 40 years, where it's like people sort of saying you can't have these high ideals, you have to be realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Donner and the film are saying is that why can't you have these high ideals? Why can't we hold people to a higher standard?
There is truth in this, what people consider fantasy of being good, being decent, believing in people, being optimistic. Yeah.
Right. It's not sort of pulling the wool over your eyes. It's seeing the world as you would like it to be and sort of making those steps to change it.
There's also something very reassuring about the idea of Superman in a world where such horrible things can happen. And I love how it's reflected by the kids in the school bus. They're about to pitch over the edge, and we have close-ups of these terrified kids, and Superman shows up, pushes the bus back, and goes, "Everybody okay? Bye." And as he flies off, you see these kids just cheering. It's really a beautiful little moment. One of my nieces, for years before she had seen the movie, before she saw the comic books, she had this big plush Superman that I gave her that she would take to bed every night. And I think that's important, that for kids, for adults, for everybody who's kind of weighed down by all the horrible stuff that happens, you need a figure like Superman to give you a little bit of hope.
Yeah, you need that sort of, that positivity. That it's not looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. It's looking at the world like, yes, there are bad things, but there's also good things.
Let's get into some of the trivia for the movie. The movie was actually so rushed to make its Christmas release date that it was actually never shown to test audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Kryptonian costumes, that glowing effect they got, was actually achieved in camera. While they were doing tests for the front projection screens for Superman flying, they realized if they turned the lights on them, they glowed in this weird particular way. So they had all the costumes made out of those. But they had to be really careful and could not touch them with their hands because any little dirt would start to reduce the glow pattern on them. As for the legacy of the movie, of course, after this, Superman would sort of be one of the big examples of creating a franchise, especially a comic book hero franchise. Like you said, this is one of the first times they really tried to do a big blockbuster based on a comic book character. Of course, as we mentioned, it was followed by Superman 2, which I still really like. For a while, I liked Superman 2 a little better. Mm-hmm. I think the first one takes it now, but it's still a very strong movie. And a lot of that comes down to Terrence Stamp, who's just such a great bad guy.
I mean, Zod is #1 over Lex, I think.
Superman 3 I still have an affection for because I saw it on the big screen as a kid. It's very silly. It has more of a structure that feels more comic book-like and feels like it would appeal to kids a little bit more. It's a very simple story. It almost feels like Superman has wandered into a James Bond movie starring Richard Pryor.
Yeah, and I love Richard Pryor, but just so wrong in this movie because for a lot of the movie, it becomes not a Superman film, but it becomes, a Richard Pryor as Gus film.
It's a Richard Pryor comedy that
right.
Superman
And while I
flies
like the character of Gus, I am here to see Christopher Reeve in tights.
It does have two things I really like. The scene with Superman split in two where he becomes evil Superman. I love that scene with him flicking peanuts at bottles in the bar and breaking them. I just had this hilarious image of Superman robbing a bank with a peanut. Just like, hey, don't move. Well, I'm ready to use this peanut.
It kind of sends a chill up your spine because here's this person with all this power. What would happen if he turned evil?
But nobody could stop him. He doesn't even become outright evil. He just becomes an asshole.
He becomes an emo asshole, I think.
Because he's not, committing huge crimes. He's just, causing vandalism, messing with the Olympic torch. And that fight scene they have in the junkyard where Clark, who becomes kind of the symbol of the good side of Superman, and him fight is such a great scene.
Oh, yeah, no. If they had built the film around that, I think it would have been a much better film.
Plus, I got to give them credit for the scene where the sister is turned into a robot, because that used to scare the piss out of me as a kid.
Yeah, that did freak me out as a kid.
Superman 4 is unfortunate because you can see Christopher Reeve went into it with the best of intentions. The idea of Superman dealing with the arms race. I mean, this is an important issue. It was at the time, and you can see that Reeve wanted to make something important with it. But Canon Films didn't have the budget, the direction is off, it's just really silly.
And the thing about 4 was that while 3 made money, it was a critical disaster, so Reeve was very much like, I'm done, I'm not doing anymore. And so Canon Films, they came to him and they said, you'll be able to write the film. And so Reeve had a lot of input on the script and actually helped co-write it. And he wanted to bring to the fore the global arms race and how a character like Superman would help in that fight. Again, there's a lot of issues with that script. The whole breathing in space thing we won't get into.
Mark Pillow's whole performance as Nuclear Man, or as Gene Hackman keeps calling him, Nuclear Man.
Just the whole film in general.
The Statue of Liberty falling on Metropolis and falling at such a slow rate.
The whole falling and putting back together of the Great Wall of China.
Suddenly Superman is telekinetic.
Yeah, totally works.
I do love the reveal of Superman being able to speak Russian when he saves the cosmonauts. That's a nice little moment.
Yep. It's unfortunate because it's the last film that we see Christopher Reeve playing Superman, and it's a really bad note to go out on.
It is. And then there's Superman Returns, which it has a lot of strong stuff. I really do enjoy it. I do think it's a little too reverent to the Richard Donner aesthetic, to the point where it feels like it doesn't have as much of an identity of its own. And I think that especially comes to the fore with Brandon Routh, who is given an impossible task. He's not asked to play Clark Kent and Superman. He's asked to play Christopher Reeve playing Clark Kent and Superman. And he tries as best he can, but, I mean, that's not really something to ask an actor to do.
I can see where you're going with that, but I have to admit that I have such a love for the original Superman films, 1 and 2, that when I saw Routh's performance, I saw it as, oh my God, that is Reeve. Like, I almost, for one instant, thought, is that Reeve's kid? Is that his son? To me, an amazing performance. There are things in the film that are a little weak to me. Kate Bosworth, fine actress, totally miscast for Lois Lane. I do like the more sinister version of Lex Luthor that Kevin Spacey plays. I think he gives it a great touch of evil. I fully enjoyed that film and would have loved to have seen Singer's planned sequel, which also would have been called Man of Steel.
Considering, I won't say what the specific plot element that he puts in the third act, just in case people haven't seen it, but he takes the movie into a really interesting direction.
Yes.
That I really want to see where they were going to go with that. Yeah.
And it totally works back to the themes of the first film.
And then, of course, we have the Zack Snyder Man of Steel one, which I still like. It's a really different take on Superman, but I'm okay with that. I think after what happened with Superman Returns, you did need to take a step in a different direction.
I respectfully disagree. I like Henry Cavill's performance. I think he does a great job. Looks great in tights. The problems that I had were, one, with Jonathan Kent. I just felt that it was such a betrayal of the character and of the canon from the comic books. And then later on in the film, when we get into the whole thing at the end with Superman doing something to a certain character, again, I felt that was totally not Superman would not do that.
What I like about it is that it isn't doing this Superman. It is taking it in a different direction, because I think you kind of need to. The Donner film, it works great, but I mean, if you were to just follow that line again, you're just doing the same thing. And I like that, no, they are going to take it off in a new direction. Not everyone's going to like it, but I like that it's a little challenging to the mythos. I almost looked at it as more taking Superman and presenting it almost as more of a science fiction movie rather than a superhero movie.
I hate to say this, I'm not a huge Snyder fan. I think a lot of what Snyder does is just use violence for violence's sake and relies on it way too much.
At times, and there's definitely scenes where the action scenes in Man of Steel get very gratuitous toward the second half.
Yeah, I have to say that there are elements of it I like. I love Amy Adams as Lois Lane.
I agree.
I love Russell Crowe as Jor-El.
I was surprised how much I liked Russell Crowe.
I'm not a big Russell Crowe fan.
I like their take on Krypton in general, actually.
So there are things I like. I am cautiously optimistic for Batman vs. Superman.
Mm-hmm.
I am cautiously optimistic for the Batfleck. I'm interested to see what he brings to the role of Superman, and I'm interested to see where Henry Cavill goes with Superman.
All right, let's get to the favorite scene, and I think we're probably pretty much in agreement on this one.
I actually have two favorite scenes.
Okay.
I think one that we'll definitely agree on, so I'll save that one for a little bit later. But my other favorite scene in the film, it's the scene after he goes flying with Lois. They do this great rear projection shot where basically Margot Kidder is standing in front of a rear projection screen. So you see the rear projection of Superman, Christopher Reeve, flying off, and then you get the wide tracking shot of Lois walking into the apartment, and you get Clark knocking on the door. So Clark comes in, and he's like, Lois, I've been knocking for an hour. And she's like, And she's totally Twitter-pated. She's totally like, oh my God. And Clark has this like a little smile on his face. He's like, this woman that I'm interested in, she's interested in me. He's like, hey, I got it, But then he realizes that, wait a minute, she's not interested in Clark. She's interested in Superman. And so he still has this smile on his face, takes his glasses off, and he straightens up, and you can immediately see, oh my God, Superman. And he's holding his glasses, and he's weighing them, and he says to Lois,
Lois, there's something I have to tell you. I'm really... I was, at first, really nervous about tonight. But then I decided, well, darn it, I was going to show you the time of your life.
That's Clark, nice.
And then he realizes he can't tell her. And he immediately sort of shrinks up again. And you can see in that moment his great desire to be honest with her and say, this guy that you are totally into, it's me. I'm not just this persona of Clark. I'm Superman too. the real me is both of them. To see that joy and sadness reflected in that performance, in that very brief moment, was just, I think, a testament to Christopher's acting and Margot's acting too. And then at the end, when they're going out the door, you still get that little smirk of Clark, because Lois is still like, yeah, that's Clark nice. And he's still like, yep, I got it. And it's just this great little moment. And the moment goes from this little charming scene to this, like, sad realization that he can't be honest with the woman that he loves. And then goes immediately right back to this, like, little thing of, well, I can take solace in the fact that she's still into me. And it's awesome. And so that's one of my favorite scenes. The other is, of course, the Lois death scene. Basically, you have your actor buried in a car. She's really buried in that car. It's
so claustrophobic the way it's shot. It's really terrifying. I remember seeing this on TV while my mother was in California to visit my uncle and being terrified that there was going to be an earthquake.
And he gets there too late, and Lois is dead, buried alive, basically. And he just has this moment where he lays her down so gently, even though she's gone. He's so gentle with her.
And he kisses her almost like he expects that's going to change something. And when it doesn't, and he lays her down and kind of hits him that she's gone. That's it.
And then he just screams a scream to end all screams. For the first time, I think, in life, he loses control and is able to just put all of his emotion, all of his pain, the pain about not being able to save his father, the pain about losing, 12 years of his life to become this, this superhero, this dual figure. And so all that pain kind of comes to a head when he loses Lois, and he just can't deal with it. And so he's like, I'm going to change this. I'm going to use my powers to change this.
It's my favorite scene too. It's a scary moment, the idea of someone with all the power that Superman has completely enraged that way and kind of out of control. It gives me chills every time I watch it.
Yeah.
And just the close-ups of him when he's doing his speed around the Earth, and you can see tears streaming down his face. A lot of people kind of interpret it as him turning the world backwards and somehow time flowing backwards. I always look at it as he's flying so fast around the Earth that he's going back in time. He's breaking the speed of light. And that's what we're seeing, everything going backwards, is just a visual representation of him going backwards in time because he's flying that fast, because he's so powered by this grief and rage that he can actually fly faster than the speed of light. I do think that while this originally was going to be the end of Superman 2, the idea was he was going to use this to undo kind of what the villains did, but also the idea that Lois finds out who he is. I really think it had to be here, because I think you need an event that horrific, that tragic, to push him to be able to do that. I think it really needed to be the climax here, because the original ending, I guess, was he would have flown in, rescued her in the nick of time, pulled her out of there, and it would have ended on a joke where she's like flipped to see who has to bring the car back to Hertz, the rental car place. And that's cute, but it really needed the impact of him going this far to save her. I think that was important. Okay, what are your recommendations? If someone likes this one, what else do you think they'd like?
Oh, God, there are so many. I think that since Christopher Reeve is one of my favorite actors, I would recommend a smaller film he did with Jenna Schwartz, who directed Supergirl. It's a lovely time travel film called Somewhere in Time, based on the Richard Matheson short story Bid Time Return. It's a beautiful love story with this character, Richard Collier, who meets this old woman who says, "Return to me," and he sees this portrait and falls in love with it, and goes back in time, meets her, falls in love. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful story, and Christopher Reeve gives a lovely performance, as does Jane Seymour. I would also recommend another film that Christopher Reeve did. It's a bit theatrical, literally. It's called Death Trap.
I thought you might say that one.
With Michael Caine, and it's based on the play Death Trap. Michael Caine plays a playwright whose wife is cheating on him with a younger man, and you find out that the younger man is just as murderous as Michael Caine, and they're trying to off one another for control of this play, and it's just this great sort of cat and mouse game.
All right, my first recommendation might seem a little bit out there, but if you like Superman and the character of Superman himself, I'd recommend the original 1951 The Day the Earth Stood Still, because I see a lot of the character of Klaatu in Superman. This idea of this very powerful alien who comes to Earth and is trying to sort of guide this species to something better. And the way that Klaatu kind of perceives the humans around him with this sort of almost paternal amusement of these people who are a lot further behind him socially and technologically, but he has a kind of an affection for them. And like Reeves, Michael Rennie has this great charisma where you just like him and how he relates to people, how kind and compassionate and very polite he is. With Klaatu, there's always a little bit more of a level of menace because you realize what he could do and may have to do to humanity at some point. But I think there's a definite correlation there. And for more kind of broad, old-fashioned superheroes, there's also, of course, the first Captain America movie, The First Avenger with Chris Evans, which, again, like Reeve in this one, takes a character who's very square and a complete do-gooder and is all for truth and justice and makes him cool and likable. And it's really tough to do without making him just like a cardboard cutout. And Evans does a great job just as Christopher Reeve does. Alrighty. That ends our conversation, but not the discussion. If you'd like to have your say about Superman or feel that we missed something, check out the comment section of this episode on cinemaspection.com and start talking. Email your comments, complaints, questions, and suggestions to cinemaspection@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. Our show is available on iTunes and Stitcher, so if you like what you hear, please subscribe to us, and if you have a moment to spare, please leave us a review. We appreciate any feedback you can offer, and your reviews help improve our visibility. We'll be back to discuss another movie next time. Until then, remember to keep watching closely. There's more to a movie than just what's on the screen. Mr. Smoker!